Alright, today we're going to be talking about The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. Like most people, I read The Secret History and I loved it, and I had heard that The Little Friend was generally regarded as an inferior book and also inferior to her later novel, The Goldfinch. And I do broadly agree with the assessment that The Little Friend isn't as good as The Secret History, and I haven't read The Goldfinch so I can't make a judgment on that, but I do think it's a very underrated book because it's very interesting and it's beautifully written. So let's talk about why. Before we get into the review, I am going to do some analysis in this video, especially of Harriet's character, and to do that I am going to have to do some spoilers. So if you haven't read the book and you care about spoilers, I wouldn't watch this review because it is going to have some analysis in it. But for those of you who have read the book, stick around and let's get on with it. Part 1, Summary. The Little Friend follows Harriet Dufresne's. Harriet's family life was broken by a tragedy that occurred 12 years before. Her older brother, Robin, was found dead hanging from a tree aged 9 years old, and the mystery of his death was never revealed. The Little Friend explores the various manifestations of grief among Harriet and her family members, touching on depression, revenge, anxiety, repression, and paranoia. It is also a coming-of-age story, signalling the end of Harriet's life as a naive, invincible child and the beginning of her transition into a dark and vulnerable adulthood. Part 2. False Expectations. So I wanted to kick off this review by comparing The Little Friend to The Secret History, because I think there are some very interesting subversions of The Secret History going on in The Little Friend that make me appreciate it quite a lot. And also because the reception to these two books couldn't have been any more different. The Secret History was a massive sensational hit, and The Little Friend was a massive disappointment for many people. So I wanted to talk about why I think that's the case. So The Little Friend had mixed to negative reviews when it came out, and even today it's still regarded as one of Tartt's worst books. Even by people who like it, including me, I would say that it is the weakest of her books. Also, it's quite common that the people I've spoken to who are familiar with Tartt's work have read The Goldfinch and they've read The Secret History, but they actually haven't read The Little Friend, and it's definitely the kind of ugly duckling of the bunch. A big reason that often gets picked up on for why the book had quite a bad reception is that it sets up a set of false expectations going in. The novel begins with the revelation that Robin, Harriet's brother, has been murdered, and the early stages of the book set the story up to be a murder mystery, with Harriet as a kind of Nancy Drew figure investigating her brother's death. Instead, it's a book that explores the impact that Robin's murder has on the psychologies and lives of its central characters. And Harriet trying to solve the murder of her brother is just one of the many manifestations of grief that we see in the story. Now, part of me couldn't help but notice that there's quite a similarity between the beginning of The Little Friend and the beginning of The Secret History, and it started to make me wonder whether Tartt wasn't having a bit of fun at her reader's expense with the way that she set this story up. The Secret History famously begins with the name of the killer being revealed on the first page, so you already know going in what's going to happen to Bunny, that he's going to die, and then the rest of the story, or at least the first half of the story, is the build-up to that death, and you're trying to work out why did this death happen. And that's a wonderful plot device. It makes for a very suspenseful story, and you should definitely read that book. Now, The Little Friend sort of does the same thing, in that it starts again, more or less, with this revelation that there's a murder, and if you've read The Secret History, probably you think that Tartt's going to be doing a similar thing in this book. So you have the kind of the pre-established expectation that it's going to be another kind of murder mystery, and then Tartt just kind of snakes off into something else, and we're left with a very different story. And so I can't help but think that maybe she did that deliberately to throw her readers off and have a bit of fun with them, and I can certainly see why that might be frustrating for readers, but I actually think it's kind of clever and kind of entertaining. In fact, I would say that The Little Friend is a great way for Tartt to show that she's not just a one-trick pony, that she's not just going to keep writing the same kind of story over and over again, that she's doing something different. And a clever and fun way to do that is to kind of tease the reader into thinking that you're going to be doing a similar thing, and then just doing something else completely different. So I can see where that would be frustrating, but I think it's quite clever, and it's interesting perhaps to see Tartt responding to the reception of her first book and showing that she's not going to be retreading old ground in this one. Another reason why I think perhaps that the reception of this book in comparison to the first book wasn't as good is that it is just a very different style of book. The Secret History does have very good character work in it, but it is a plot-based story. It's mainly about the suspense to do with the murder and the characters' reactions, and there's lots of build-up in terms of the plot throughout the story, and it feels very structured and tight, whereas The Little Friend, on the other hand, feels kind of meandering. It wanders around quite a lot. Sometimes you'll go through long periods without much happening. And so if you enjoyed The Secret History, you're probably a reader who prefers plot-based stories, and so you might find this disappointing because it's just quite character-based and meandering. In any case, whatever the reason for why this book had a worse reception, I do think that reception was a little bit unjustified. The Little Friend is a very different book from The Secret History, but I think that that's a good thing. Tartt still tells an interesting, compelling story with some great characters, in fact I would say some of her best characters, and it's definitely worth a read, even if it's very different from that first book. Part 3. Harriet, a dark coming-of-age tale. So I've already said that The Little Friend is mainly focused on characters, and it centres around Robin's death and the impact that his death has on the various characters in the story. Now, if I wanted to go into depth about all the characters, this video would be very long, but what I will say very briefly is that all the characters in this book are fantastic, especially Harriet's three or four grandmothers. They're just wonderful characters, as well as her friend Healy, who she has a very fun, kind of antagonistic sometimes relationship with. All of these characters are just great. However, I'm going to focus on Harriet because she's the linchpin of the story, and I kind of want to focus on one dimension of the story that I think was quite apparent to me while I was reading it. But before we get to that, I'll also say very briefly why I think that Harriet is such a fantastic character. So I think there's a tendency with authors, when they're writing child characters, to either go down two avenues. One of the avenues is to kind of paint the child as being really infantile and maybe giving them an irritating baby voice and making them really innocent and passive and sweet, to a point where as a reader you just hate reading the scenes with the child because they're just really annoying. On the other hand, you have writers who try and present the child character as incredibly mature to the point where it stretches believability. Now, when we begin the novel, Tartt seems to actually be doing that second kind of trope. She seems to be presenting Harriet as this wisecracking, mischievous, brave, powerful, wonder kid. But actually, as the novel progresses, we realise that Harriet is not these things. And this is why I really like Harriet as a character. Because at the beginning of the story, she does see herself as this invincible, powerful kid who knows everything and can do whatever she wants. But as the story progresses, she realises that that isn't the case. And I think this is the linchpin for Harriet's character development, and it's the thing that I want to focus on in this section. So one of Harriet's big character moments is the realisation that she is not immortal. One of the things that we think as children is that we will go on forever. Not just that we'll live forever, but that we'll always be kids, mummy and daddy will always be there, everything will stay the same. We might be aware that death exists in some kind of nebulous way, but we don't necessarily understand what death actually means. There's a great example of this actually that I read recently in Freud's book, The Interpretation of Dreams, where he mentions a female patient who's talking about her son, and her husband, his father, just died, and the kid would say every night at dinner, "I understand that daddy's dead, but when is he gonna come home?" And this is the kind of thing that I'm getting at here. It's this idea that children sort of do understand death, in the sense that they know that the person's gone, but they don't fully understand what it means. They don't understand the permanence of it, and they don't necessarily grasp that it's going to happen to them just as well as the people around them. And it's the naivety of this child in Freud's little story there that I think really encapsulates Harriet's character. And there are three things, I think, in the story that kind of show that this is how she thinks. She sort of sees herself as invincible and she doesn't really understand death. But then in the course of the story, she has to actually come to terms with these realities. So the first thing is her quest to find the killer of Robin. Tartt kind of sets up Harriet, as I've said, as a Nancy Drew or Tom Sawyer-like character. She comes across as this mischievous whiz kid who's smarter than the other kids, who's better than them, she's cooler than them, and you actually think, going into it, that yeah, she probably will solve this murder because she's so cool and she can do it. But, of course, Harriet will actually fail in this quest. And this is actually one of the reasons why people tend to dislike The Little Friend, because it kind of sets itself up as this Nancy Drew murder mystery type thing, but then actually turns into something else, which is a lot more depressing, but in my view, a lot deeper. Because what Harriet realizes when she gets to the end of the story, and she's almost died, getting herself into this dangerous situation, trying to find her brother's killer, is that she isn't invincible. She has to confront death, and she does. And that is a really important lesson for a child to learn, and luckily we don't have to necessarily learn it ourselves in such a terrifying way. But Harriet does learn it in this terrifying way. She realizes that she's not the hero of any kind of story, that she doesn't understand and she'll never solve this murder mystery. The second thing that I noticed in the story is Harriet's attachment to being a child and not realising that one day she will actually grow up. Until one point in the story when she goes to a summer camp and she sees some girls, I think they're slightly older than her, and they've started to hit puberty and get breasts and all that kind of stuff. And Harriet resents that. She really is sort of almost terrified of the fact that in just a year or so, she is going to be one of those girls. She's going to, go through puberty. And she has this moment of realization that her childhood is not going to last forever. It's a very small scene again, but I think it's a very important one because it's another example of Harriet having to confront her own mortality. She's not going to be a child forever. She's going to, morph into this adult and the adult world, and she's kind of afraid of that. And finally, the third way that Harriet has to confront mortality is through the loss of her guardian figures. One is the death of one of her relatives, which has a big impact on her, and another one is the departure of her family maid, who leaves the story partway through, and Harriet doesn't seem to understand the impact that this is going to have on her later in life. One thing that she'll do in the story is not be there when the maid leaves, and this is something that we learn has a massive impact on her later on, because she regrets it. So these are just 3 examples of Harriet having to confront her own mortality in the story. And I do think it's one of the really big lessons of the book and big themes of the book. When we start out, we've got Harriet as this Wonder Kid type character who thinks she's invincible, she thinks she's going to be a kid forever, and through the course of the story, she realizes that she will grow up, that she will die, and that everyone around her will die. And it's very tragic and very sad, but I think it makes for a much better story than a simple murder mystery with a spunky little 12-year-old. Part 4. Childhood and Nostalgia. Donna Tartt, Charles Dickens, and Mark Twain. So I couldn't help when I was reading this book, because I'm aware of Tartt's influences as a writer. She's talked about Dickens, she's talked about Mark Twain. I couldn't help but see the influence of these writers on her work in this book. But I don't think that Tartt is just being a copyist of these 2 writers. I think that what she does in this Little Friend is she takes ideas and elements and styles from these 2 writers, but does very interesting and very different things with them to create something entirely new. So Mark Twain is best known for his novels Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Now in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, we get this atmosphere of nostalgia and of childhood innocence, and we see Tom going from a kind of spunky, silly child to reaching maturity, much like in The Little Friend. And I think that both books do a very good job of capturing kind of that pathos and sadness when you reach that moment in childhood when you realise that this is going to end soon, and you're going to grow up and you're going to drift apart from your childhood friends. But there is a key difference, I think, between the way that Mark Twain does this and the way that Donna Tartt does this. With The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which I did enjoy a lot when I read it, I couldn't help but think or feel that this is very much the story of a grown adult, or man in this case, looking back on his childhood, feeling really nostalgic and wanting to just kind of bring that nostalgia to life. And while that's fine, and it's a very good story because of that, it does mean that Tom Sawyer as a character feels more like an adult's idea of childhood innocence and less like a complex, fully realised character in his own right. Tom Sawyer is just a little bit too perfect. He seems to always win in the end. He's always kind of joking around and everything's always happy. Even though there are little dark things occurring in the background, he always tends to have his day. I wouldn't say that he's quite the level of a Mary Sue kind of character, like say Mona again from Anne Rice's books, but certainly he is maybe a little bit too, powerful as a character. He's not particularly vulnerable and he's not that psychologically complex. I was always a lot more convinced by Huckleberry Finn in those books. I felt like his character was a lot more grounded than Tom Sawyer's. Now with The Little Friend, Tartt is certainly doing a similar thing, and certain parts of the book, especially the bits between Healy and Harriet when they're kind of splashing each other in the pool, these do kind of conjure up that nostalgic feeling. But it doesn't feel like an older woman reflecting on childhood and projecting kind of her ideas of innocence onto it. Both Healy and Harriet feel like fully fleshed out characters. There's a lot of darkness in Harriet's psychology. There's a lot of darkness in her family life, and unlike in Tom Sawyer where the darkness is almost background, this darkness is very much a part of Harriet's character, and her story is one of significant character growth as this darkness starts to kind of close in on her as she makes some pretty bad decisions. So I think there's a degree of gritty realism in The Little Friend that isn't there in Tom Sawyer. And it's this kind of gritty realism where I think that the connection to Dickens comes up. A lot of the secondary characters in The Little Friend feel very much like the American version anyway, of Dickensian characters. They're all a bit broken, they're all a bit kooky, and the world that they inhabit is grisly, it's dark, and there's lots of conflict always going on around them. But again, it's not just a kind of rehash of Dickensian ideas. One thing that I think Tartt does very well, especially with her child characters, that I don't think Dickens does as well, is she creates very complex child characters. I always felt like with Dickens, you've got characters like Oliver Twist, who are just this kind of innocent child character who are so passive even in their own stories. Whereas Tartt gives a much more psychologically complex and active character in Harriet and also in Healy. But you can certainly feel the influence of Dickens on The Little Friend. And it was something that I found made me appreciate the book all that more, because you can tell that she's really studied these great texts and she's incorporating them into her work, but she's doing very new and interesting things with them. Part 5. 10 years to write, 10 years to read. So now on to something maybe slightly negative about The Little Friend. It's a very tough book to read. I listened to the audiobook on Audible, and usually I can do that reasonably fast, but it actually took me 2 months to get through this book. The first lag came about actually when I got to the point where I realised this wasn't going to be a murder mystery. It was just after Harriet calls who she thinks is the killer on the phone, and then the story just does that kind of 180 and goes down a different path. And I did kind of, not necessarily lose interest, but I did find myself flagging, and so it took me a little bit longer to actually get through the book than I usually would take. A big part of that, I think, is just that The Little Friend just isn't one of those books that lends itself to quick reading. Unlike The Secret History again, which is kind of tight, it's more like a thriller and you just kind of want to just read. The Little Friend is a much longer and meandering book. The chapters in this book are huge, at least on my Audible thing. The chapters were just absolutely massive. It was all kind of ridiculous how few chapters there are in such a big book. And within these chapters, not a lot happens. You can spend a whole chapter in just a day of Harriet's life as she's doing various things. And when you're reading it, you're not really sure what all these significance all these things are going to have. But once I accepted that the story wasn't going to be a murder mystery, and especially as I got to kind of the last third of it, I started to get back into it, and I begun to really appreciate not so much even the story at that point, but just the way it was written and just the atmosphere that Tartt creates in this book. It really does read like the atmosphere that she's trying to create. This kind of hot, languid summer day where you're lazily reclining in the sun because it's just too hot to do anything. The book just has that feel, just sprawling, endless, hot, almost oppressive in places. But at the same time, it is very enjoyable to read because Tartt has a very accessible and poetic style, which are two things that are really hard to put together and do well. So I think when approaching this book, and when I read it again, which I definitely will, I'm just going to really take my time with it because I think that there's a lot in there. In this video, I've only really touched on Harriet, but there are so many other themes and ideas in this book that come out in the other characters as well. In fact, there's a really good review on YouTube actually by Just Juan Reader, and I'll link it in the description, where he really goes into some of the big themes in the story. And after watching that video, I really do want to go back and read it because it seems like there's a lot in there that I'm missing. So if you're interested, I'll link that video and you can go watch it because it does kind of get into some of the broader themes in the story and some of the psychoanalytic concepts at play as well. So when you read this book, just like it took Tartt 10 years to actually publish it, take your time with it. And I think if you take your time with it, if you just read, say, a chapter and then leave it for a while, reflect on it, think about it, come back to it when you feel like it, I think that would be a much better way to approach this book because I think it just lends itself to that long reading process. And again, I think that that's something that does connect Tartt back to Dickens. A lot of Dickens' big novels like Bleak House were published in a serialized format. So you would actually, if you were reading that at the time, you'd be reading this over the course of a year or two. I think the same is true of The Little Friend. Obviously it's published as a complete novel, but because Tartt is spending such a long time on the book and it has this very slow quality, I think that actually it would just read better if you did it over a longer period of time, rather than trying to just consume everything all in one go, as it's very tempting to do these days. Part 6, Conclusion. So overall, I think that The Little Friend is definitely an overlooked and underrated book in Tartt's catalogue. I didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoyed The Secret History, but that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy it, and that doesn't mean that I wouldn't recommend it. At the moment I gave it a 4-star review on Goodreads, but I'm not sure if it will stay at 4 stars. It could go up because it is a book that, it's one of those books where you finish it and then it kind of lingers in the mind and you kind of feel this pull back to it, which I think is usually the sign of a 5-star novel. So I'll have to see when I do that second read if things really kind of stand out to me. So it may definitely go up in my estimations once I do that second read. But if you love a character-based story, if you like a coming-of-age story that's a lot darker and grittier than a lot of coming-of-age stories, then you should definitely give this book a read. And if you've only read The Goldfinch or only read The Secret History or both of them, and you've been put off by the negative reviews of this book, I would definitely encourage you to pick it up and give it a read, because I think there's a lot to explore and a lot of interesting things about this book. Alright, that's it for this video. Let me know what you think of The Little Friend in the comments. I'll be interested to see what you make of it and how you think it compares to Tartt's other work if you've read them. But until next time, take care everyone. Ta-ra!